Something moved through the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago, and it did not come from this world. It arrived the way most things in the universe travel, silent, patient, indifferent. An asteroid punched through the atmosphere and buried itself deep in the Gulf of Mexico, triggering the mass extinction event that ended the dinosaurs and cleared the evolutionary stage for something smaller to inherit the planet. What no one knew for 65 million years was that the asteroid carried a passenger, something nested inside the rock, something that had been waiting, across distances the human mind cannot hold, for a suitable world to open itself up. That passenger would eventually be called the Black Marker. And here is where the story the games tell starts to fall apart. Because the story we tell ourselves about the markers is a horror story in the most basic sense. There is a monster. The monster wants to kill us. We resist. We fight. We try to survive. The marker, in our version of the story, is evil. It is malicious. It delights in turning our dead into weapons against us and collapsing civilizations into screaming biomass. The Church of Unitology that worships it is deluded. The Necromorphs it creates are enemies. The convergence it builds toward is apocalypse. That story is emotionally satisfying. It is also incomplete. What if the markers are not evil? You may have heard of the zombie ant fungus, the organism that hijacks a living ant, steers it to a precise location, kills it there, and then uses the body to spread itself to the next host. No malice, no hatred, just a biological system doing exactly what it was built to do. That is what this video argues the markers are doing to us. And by the end, that comparison is going to feel a lot less like a metaphor and a lot more like a diagnosis. This video is going to argue something. It will not recap events in sequence or walk through the game's plot beat by beat. Instead, it is going to examine the marker system the way a scientist would examine an organism, looking at its mechanisms, its life cycle, its interactions with its environment, and asking what problem each feature actually solves. By the end, you will understand the markers in a way the games gesture toward but never fully articulate. And that understanding will make the whole thing considerably more terrifying than any version where an ancient evil simply wants everyone dead. This is original analysis. It is not the game telling you what to think about the markers. It is an attempt to look at the markers from the outside, to apply the lens of real biology and behavioral science and see what reflects back. If something in this video connects with you, drop a comment below letting me know which moment landed. Whether it was a specific detail, a connection you made, or just a thought that stayed with you after. You can also throw out a topic suggestion while you are there. Some of the best ideas for this channel have come from you. So now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let us start. Chapter 1. When the sky sent something down. The Chicxulub crater sits beneath the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, buried under sediment and time. From the surface, you cannot see it. You would not know it was there unless someone told you. The crater measures roughly 180 kilometers across. Scientists believe it formed when an asteroid approximately 10 kilometers in diameter struck the Earth and triggered a chain of events that ended around 75% of all species alive at the time. It is the most famous extinction event in the history of this planet. And for a long time, humanity considered it a catastrophic accident. In the world of Dead Space, it was neither accidental nor empty. The Black Marker arrived inside that asteroid. It was buried in the crater's deepest layer, silent and inert as the planet recovered around it. Forests grew, mammals diversified, primate lineages split and branched, intelligence emerged, and through all of it, across every extinction and adaptation and evolutionary leap, the Black Marker sat in the dark beneath the ocean floor and waited. Whether it was conscious during this period is something the games leave deliberately unclear. What is clear is that the marker was not dormant in the way a rock is dormant. Its signal was present, broadcasting at frequencies too low for early life to detect, too subtle for any organism short of a complex brain to process. 65 million years is a long time to wait, but from the perspective of a system designed to operate across cosmic scales, it is not. The Brethren moons, the massive entities that produce and seed black markers, exist in a universe where civilizations rise and fall like seasons. A planet takes millions of years to evolve something worth harvesting. The black marker is not in a hurry because it cannot afford to be. It is built for patience in the same way a seed is built for patience. The seed does not experience the winter, it simply waits. By the year 2214, humanity had spread beyond Earth into a network of colonies sustained by increasingly strained energy resources. The energy crisis was real and acute. Resource depletion had reached a point where governments and corporations were searching desperately for alternative power sources, and a strange signal emanating from the Yucatan Peninsula had been quietly tracked for some time before the geophysicist Michael Altman began investigating it properly. What the signal promised was extraordinary. Preliminary analysis suggested the source was emitting an electromagnetic field that appeared to represent a source of almost limitless energy. There is something worth sitting with in that particular detail. The first thing the black marker offered humanity was not death, it was not madness or necromorphs or the grinding machinery of convergence. The first thing it offered was exactly what a resource-starved civilization needed most: the promise of endless power. In the context of everything that follows, this reads as coincidental. In the context of what the marker actually is, it is neither coincidental nor generous. It is a feature, a precisely calibrated opening move. Consider what it means for a biological system trying to perpetuate its life cycle, to arrive on a planet where an intelligent species is actively motivated to seek it out. The marker does not need to announce itself. It does not need to be loud or aggressive or threatening. It only needs to be appealing enough that the right kind of mind will come to it, will want to study it, will bring resources and attention, and eventually the technical capability to replicate it. The electromagnetic signal that registers as limitless energy is the marker's version of a flower's color. It is an advertisement, a lure, and humanity walked toward it exactly as intended. Altman's investigation of the signal pulled the black marker up from the crater and into human hands, and what happened next established the pattern that would repeat across every marker event in the series. The people around the marker began to change. The exposure to its signal produced effects that researchers struggled to categorize because the effects were not uniform. Some people experienced depression, some experienced escalating paranoia, some began having vivid hallucinations, some started scrawling strange symbols they could not consciously explain, covering available surfaces with markings in an alien language they had never encountered before, but somehow, in some wordless biological way, their brains could render. The marker's signal was not passive, it was doing something to human neurology. Altman himself appeared relatively resistant. Whether this was genetic, neurological, or some factor the games and expanded lore leave undefined is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that he recognized the danger the marker represented and attempted to return it to the crater. He failed, in the sense that the larger forces around him, the corporations and government bodies that had become invested in the marker's energy potential, prevented him from simply sinking the problem. He was eventually eliminated by the same institutional structure that wanted to control the marker rather than remove it. Here is the detail that tends to get lost in how Altman's story is usually told. His death was made useful. The people who ended his life turned him into a symbol, into a martyr, and the religion they built from that martyrdom would carry the marker's influence forward more effectively than any direct threat could have. Unitology was founded in Altman's name, preaching the marker's message of convergence as spiritual truth. The people who controlled the marker used Altman's documented experiences with it to build a faith that would, within a few centuries, become the most powerful religious organization humanity had ever known. The marker did not need to do any of this consciously. The sequence of events was a consequence of the signal's effects operating on the minds already in proximity to the artifact. The violence, the institutional cover-up, the martyrdom, the religion, all of it emerged from the interaction between the marker's electromagnetic output and human psychology. No planning required, no malice required, just a system doing what it was built to do, and human behavior providing the medium. The black marker went back into hiding. Altman's death seeded a religion, and the clock began counting down toward the next phase. Centuries later, the pattern would repeat at Aegis 7, then at the Sprawl, orbiting Saturn, then at Tau Volantis. Each time, the sequence rhymed with what happened around the Chicxulub crater. Each time, the marker's presence produced the same cascade of effects at different scales. Each time, humanity's response, a combination of institutional greed, genuine curiosity, religious fervor, and individual desperation, fed directly into the system the marker needed to function. By the time Isaac Clarke boarded the USG Kellyan and set a course for the silent Ishimura, the pattern had been repeating for centuries. The sequence that consumed the Aegis 7 colony and the Ishimura's crew was not an attack in any meaningful military sense. It was closer to what happens when a fire reaches a forest that has been accumulating dry timber for a very long time. What lights the fire is the marker's signal. What burns is everything the marker has been slowly preparing. We will get to the fire in a moment, but first it is worth understanding the match. Chapter 2. The shape of the signal. The marker's shape is not decorative. Every version of the marker, black or red, ancient or man-made, is a double helix. Two spires twist upward from a common base, corkscrewing around each other until they nearly touch at the top. If you have spent any time in a biology classroom, that shape is immediately familiar. It mirrors the structure of DNA. This is not accidental. The marker's surface is covered in a dense system of symbols, an alien language that encodes, among other things, the complete genetic blueprint for the Necromorph infection. The symbols are the instruction manual. The shape is the signal. When researchers on Aegis 7 began studying the red marker found by the colony's miners, the first thing the science teams noted was the electromagnetic field it projected. This field was measurable, consistent, and extremely complex. At the frequencies most directly detectable by human neural tissue, the signal behaved in ways that no natural electromagnetic phenomenon had ever been observed to behave. It did not simply radiate outward. It appeared to interact with the human brain in specific ways, depending on the specific neurological composition of whoever was exposed. The marker was reading its audience. This distinction matters enormously. Most threats in science fiction operate through direct force. A weapon destroys indiscriminately. A pathogen kills everyone it contacts. The marker is more sophisticated than either of these. Its signal produces different effects in different people, calibrated, though perhaps not consciously, to what each individual brain can and cannot process. People whose brains cannot integrate the signal's complexity experience it as noise, and noise in the brain produces depression, paranoia, the feeling of being watched, the sensation that the symbols around them are whispering. This is marker dementia in its early stages. People whose brains have a specific compatibility with the marker's signal, what the game's lore describes as a DNA-level resonance, experience something different, something more directed. The hallucinations they receive are not chaotic, they are informational. These individuals begin to understand the marker's language, to see the replication codes embedded in the symbols covering its surface, and their minds are guided, very deliberately, toward building more markers. Isaac Clarke is the most visible example. His brain's compatibility with the marker's signal is why he survives events that kill everyone around him, and why the marker uses the image of Nicole Brennan, his deceased companion, to manipulate his behavior across multiple games. Here's what this tells us about the marker as a system. It can identify, within a population, which individuals are useful alive and which are more useful as dead biomass. The ones it drives towards suicide and mutual violence are feeding the next phase of the life cycle. The ones it protects and guides are tools for propagating itself forward. This is not arbitrary. It is sorting, the way a biological system sorts organic material, directing each component toward the function it can best perform. The double helix shape does something else, something that operates even before the signal comes into play. It looks significant. It looks designed. In every culture humanity has produced, objects that are symmetrical, elevated, and visually complex tend to be treated as sacred. The marker is an obelisk. Its shape is mathematically precise. Its surface markings appear to be a coherent written language. Every instinct the human mind has developed for recognizing intentional creation fires when it encounters a marker. Of course, a religion formed around it. Of course, people venerated it. The marker appears to every heuristic a human brain uses to evaluate the world, to be the product of a vastly superior intelligence, and vastly superior intelligences in human cultural history have reliably been assigned divine status. The marker's appearance is also part of the lure. The marker does not simply broadcast a signal. It presents itself as the product of something worth worshipping, and a worshipped object gets protected, studied, replicated, and distributed across a civilization's territory, all without requiring a single conscious decision from the marker itself. Whether the markers are conscious in any way the human mind would recognize is something the games deliberately decline to resolve. The Brethren moons are clearly intelligent. They communicate with each other through a galaxy-spanning network. They strategize, they manipulate, they identify targets and exploit weaknesses, but the individual markers scattered across planetary surfaces may function less like minds and more like organs, each one doing its part of a larger process without needing to independently plan or decide anything. The way a kidney does not need to decide to filter blood, the way a lung does not need to decide to exchange gases. The function is built in. This distinction between the system that thinks and the components that simply function is crucial to understanding the argument this video is making. When we call the marker evil, we are imagining it as a mind that chose to do harm. When we look at it as a biological system, we see something colder and more precise, something that does not choose anything because it does not need to. The signal, the shape, the sorting of the population, the guidance of compatible minds toward replication, all of it is built in. All of it runs on its own, and the results feel like malice only because we are the ones experiencing them from the inside. Keep this in mind, because the next time you encounter something in Dead Space that seems like cruelty, it is worth asking, what biological function does this serve? The answer, almost every time, is one you already know from the natural world. You just have not seen it operating at a planetary scale before. Chapter 3. What the Mushroom Knows. There is a forest in Brazil. Tropical, dense, layered. The kind of place where the canopy is so thick that very little light reaches the ground level, and most of the activity in the ecosystem happens far above the soil. In that forest, on the underside of leaves at a very specific height, ants die in a specific position. Their mandibles are locked around the central vein of the leaf. Their bodies are fixed in place, and from the back of each ant's head, a thin, dark stalk protrudes, slowly extending, preparing to release a cloud of microscopic spores onto the ants walking below. The ant did not choose to climb to this height. It did not choose to bite down on this leaf. It did not choose to die in this position, at this precise elevation, at this precise time of day. Something chose for it. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis is a parasitic fungus that infects specific species of carpenter ants in tropical forests around the world. Its life cycle depends entirely on behavioral manipulation. When a spore lands on an ant's exoskeleton, it penetrates the cuticle using a combination of mechanical pressure and enzymes. Once inside the host, the fungal cells proliferate through the ant's body, colonizing muscle tissue, distributing themselves through the ant's entire physical structure. The fungus does not invade the ant's brain. Researchers studying infected ants have consistently found that the central nervous system is left largely intact. The fungus, instead, manipulates its host through chemical means. It secretes compounds that alter the ant's neurological state from the outside, changing the signals that the nervous system receives, without directly taking over the central control structure. The ant experiences what happens to it, the way a person on a drug they did not choose to take experiences what the drug does to them. The internal experience may feel like action, like decision, like the ant is simply walking where it wants to walk, and climbing because climbing feels right. But the behavior is steered, the destination is predetermined. When the ant bites down on the underside of a leaf at precisely the right elevation for spore dispersal, the fungus has accomplished its goal. The ant dies. The fruiting body grows from the corpse. Spores rain down on the ants below. The cycle continues. There is no cruelty in this. The fungus does not experience the ant's death as a victory. The ant does not experience its manipulation as a violation. The entire transaction happens at the level of biochemistry, driven by evolutionary pressure that selected for the most efficient reproductive strategy the fungus could develop. Calling Ophiocordyceps evil would be a category error. It is not evil, it is effective. Now scale that logic up by several orders of magnitude. The marker's signal interacts with human dead tissue in a way that directly parallels the fungal spore's interaction with the ant's body. The electromagnetic signal encodes a genetic instruction set, the same way the fungus encodes a biochemical instruction set, and that instruction set, when it contacts dead cellular tissue, triggers a transformation process. The dead tissue does not simply reanimate, it is recombined. It is reorganized at the cellular level according to a template that maximizes the dead body's usefulness for a specific biological purpose, acquiring more dead bodies, which will be gathered for the convergence process that produces a brethren moon. The necromorph, seen through this lens, is not a monster. It is a fruiting body. More precisely, it is the mechanism by which the marker extends its reach. The same way Ophiocordyceps produces a fruiting body to disperse spores onto more ants below, the marker produces necromorphs to convert more bodies into the biomass required for the next stage of its life cycle. The necromorph's aggression, its drive to kill every living organism it encounters, is not predatory behavior in the way a wolf is predatory. It is harvesting behavior. The necromorph is not eating, it is preparing raw material. Living bodies become dead bodies. Dead bodies become necromorphs. Necromorphs gather around the marker when the biomass threshold is reached, and convergence begins. The fungus climbs the ant's body to reach an optimal elevation. The marker's necromorphs sweep a planetary population to generate an optimal volume of biomass. The underlying logic is identical. The scale is cosmological rather than tropical. Here is where the analogy becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Ophiocordyceps, as researchers have noted, does not always devastate entire ant colonies. It operates within ecological limits. The fungus can be controlled by hyperparasites, other fungi that attack it and limit spore production. Ant colonies have been observed to detect infected members and carry them away from the colony before the manipulation takes full effect. There are checks in the system. The fungus is powerful, but it exists within a web of pressures that prevent it from simply consuming everything. The marker system has no such checks, or rather the checks that exist in dead space are the product of civilizations that recognized what they were dealing with and built something to stop it, the alien machine on Tau Volantis being the clearest example. In the absence of deliberate countermeasures, the marker's life cycle runs to completion. No natural predator exists for the system. No ecological pressure limits it. It has been operating across the galaxy for so long that it has consumed, according to the lore's most chilling implications, every other intelligent species that encountered it before humanity. What Ophiocordyceps does to one ant colony, the marker system has done to civilization after civilization across the Milky Way. The ant does not know it has been infected. It does not know it is walking toward a specific leaf at a specific elevation for reasons that have nothing to do with its own needs. It simply finds, as the fungus tightens its chemical grip, that climbing feels correct, that biting this particular vein of this particular leaf feels like exactly the right thing to do. The colonists on Aegis 7, who began scrawling marker symbols on the walls of their homes, did not know they were being manipulated. The unitologists, who devoted their lives to worshiping the markers and working toward convergence, did not experience their faith as manipulation. They experienced it as revelation, as purpose, as something finally true in a universe that had felt empty. The fungus makes the ant feel like it is doing exactly what it wants to do. The marker makes the people around it feel like they are finally understanding what they were always meant to understand. The ant dies in the grip of this feeling, locked onto a leaf, at the right height, in the right position, at the right time. The colonists did not die that cleanly. but the process that consumed them was, at the level of cold biological logic, the same. There is something in this that the Dead Space games never say explicitly, but that lives underneath everything they show. When you walk through the Ishimura's corridors and see the walls covered in scrawled symbols, when you read the logs of researchers who are clearly losing themselves to the signal and do not know it, when you watch characters around Isaac fall apart in ways that feed directly into the marker's machinery, you are watching the ant climb the leaf. You are watching a species being guided, precisely and without mercy, toward the position the system needs them to occupy. The mushroom does not think. The marker may not need to. Both of them, across wildly different scales, know exactly where they want the bodies to end up, and that is not even the most disturbing part of what the marker's signal does to the living. The most disturbing part is what happens before anyone dies at all. Chapter 4: The Purpose of Madness. A man named Harris was evacuated from the Aegis 7 colony in the weeks before the full Necromorph outbreak. When investigators debriefed him, he recounted events on the colony in ways that did not fit any coherent timeline. He described violence that could not be verified. He insisted he had committed no crime, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. He showed no remorse. He exhibited a specific pattern of behavior that had been documented at earlier marker exposure sites. Long periods of apparent normalcy interrupted by intervals of compulsive writing, covering surfaces with symbols he could not explain, repeating the phrase, "make it whole again." Harris was not unique, he was representative. The marker's signal, as it interacts with human neurology, does not produce a single consistent effect. It produces a spectrum of effects calibrated to the specific individual. At the population level, however, the spectrum follows a predictable distribution. Most people exposed to the marker signal over time will experience depression first, then sleep disruption, then paranoia, the increasing conviction that something is wrong, that they are being watched, that the symbols they keep seeing in their peripheral vision mean something they cannot decode, then hallucinations, then, in a significant proportion of cases, extreme violence directed at others or at themselves. None of this is random. Every symptom in the sequence serves a function. Depression and sleep disruption destabilize the infected individual's social environment. A person who is consistently depressed and cannot sleep becomes erratic in ways that strain relationships. They say things that are difficult to explain. They behave in ways that their colleagues and families struggle to accommodate. This erosion of social bonds is significant. Humans, under stress, rely heavily on their support networks for stability. When the marker's signal begins degrading those networks at the individual level, it is simultaneously degrading the community's capacity to respond coherently to a crisis. By the time the violence begins, the social infrastructure that would normally coordinate a response has already been partially dismantled. The paranoia phase accelerates this. Paranoid individuals do not trust each other, they hoard information. They form factions based on suspicion rather than cooperation. The Aegis 7 colony's collapse was not simply a matter of bodies falling to necromorphs. The colony fell to itself first. The violence that preceded the necromorph outbreak was human violence, neighbor turning on neighbor, groups forming and fracturing within hours, the entire social fabric of the settlement unraveling under the signal's influence before a single corpse reanimated. The dead bodies that resulted from this human violence were the first biomass the marker collected. Think about the efficiency of this. The marker does not need to kill everyone itself. It does not need to deploy necromorphs to do the initial harvesting. It primes a human population's own psychology to generate deaths, then processes those deaths into the next phase. The initial necromorph outbreak on Aegis 7 emerged from a population that had already been turning its own members into corpses for weeks. The Ophiocordyceps fungus accomplishes something structurally similar. The infected ant, in the later stages of manipulation, becomes disoriented and begins leaving the foraging trails. It wanders erratically. This wandering eventually separates the ant from the colony, reducing the colony's ability to detect and remove the infected member before the fungus reaches its reproductive stage. The behavior modification is not only about guiding the ant toward the right leaf, it is also about separating the ant from any system that might interrupt the process. The marker separates people from their communities. The signal erodes trust and cooperation, which are the very things that allow a community to protect itself. An isolated person, like an isolated ant, is much easier to guide toward the position the system needs, but the paranoia and violence are only half the picture. For a specific subset of exposed individuals, the marker's signal does something different. Rather than driving toward violence, it drives toward understanding. These individuals begin to experience what might be called structured hallucinations. Rather than noise, they receive something approaching signal. The symbols covering the marker's surface begin to resolve, in their minds, into comprehensible information. They start to understand the marker's language without having been taught it. They begin to perceive the replication codes, the instructions for building new markers, the blueprint encoded in the marker's double helix structure. These are the people the marker keeps alive. They are the builders. In the game's framing, they are the ones who eventually construct red markers, the copies of the black marker that an intelligent civilization creates once the signal has guided them to the required level of technical knowledge. They are also the people most profoundly altered by the experience, because the hallucinations they receive are not simply instructional, they are immersive. The marker communicates through the emotional frequencies of the exposed mind, using the faces and voices of dead loved ones, using whatever internal landscape will be most persuasive, to steer the builder toward the required outcome. Isaac Clarke is the most extensively documented case of this. His exposure to the marker imprinted a self-replicating signal in his brain. The hallucination of Nicole Brennan that haunts him across the first game is the marker using his grief as a control mechanism. Nicole, as Isaac experiences her, speaks. She guides. She appears at crucial moments and directs his attention and behavior in ways that serve the marker's purposes. Isaac believes, for significant portions of the first game, that his goal is to save Nicole. He believes this because the marker needs him to believe it. The emotional payload of the hallucination makes it effective. A man trying to save someone he loved is a man who will push through any obstacle. The ant does not know the fungus is using its muscles. Isaac does not know, at least for a while, that his grief is the lever. The marker's manipulation of the living, through violence, social collapse, and guided hallucination, is not cruelty for its own sake. It is a sophisticated behavioral management system operating across the full range of a population's psychological vulnerabilities. The violent and the grieving and the desperate and the curious are all sorted into roles that serve the life cycle. The violent generate biomass. The grieving are guided. The curious study the marker and eventually build copies. Every role has a function. Every function serves the reproduction. The madness is the system working. The grief is the system working. The violence is the system working. And the system does not care, any more than the fungus cares about the ant, what any of it feels like from the inside. That explains what the marker does to the living populations it encounters. It does not explain what it does to the dead. That half of the equation is where the biology becomes genuinely strange. Chapter 5: The Architecture of the Dead. When a corpse falls within the marker's area of influence, something very specific begins to happen at the cellular level. The marker's electromagnetic signal is not simply radiation, it carries information. A code in the signal structure is a genetic instruction set, a blueprint for a particular form of life that does not occur naturally anywhere in the universe but is instead produced by the marker itself. When this signal penetrates dead tissue, it interacts with the cellular machinery that is still partially intact in the hours after death. Dead cells are not immediately inert. They still contain DNA. They still contain the molecular components that, in life, carry out protein synthesis and cellular replication. The marker's signal takes those components and repurposes them, not to restart life as it was, but to initiate a radically different process. The dead tissue is absorbed, recombined, then reanimated. What rises from this process is not the person who died. The brain structures that defined personality and memory and identity are gone, or rather, they are irrelevant. The entity that rises from the marker's transformation of a human corpse is not controlled by its brain at all. The necromorph is controlled remotely, via the marker signal itself and the larger hive mind structure that the signal supports. Shooting a necromorph in the head has no more effect than cutting someone's hair would. The head is not the command center, the marker is. This is one of Dead Space's most elegant design decisions and one of its most philosophically interesting details. The body that becomes a necromorph is genuinely no longer using its own nervous system as the organizing principle. It has been repurposed. The architecture of the body is redesigned for a specific function, and that function is determined by whatever role the marker system needs filled at that stage. The transformation is not uniform. Different corpses produce different necromorph forms. Some are optimized for direct assault and killing, the slashers and lurkers that form the majority of the outbreak. Some are specialized for rapid conversion of new bodies, the infectors that accelerate the spread of the infection. Some are built for environmental control, growing into the walls and floors of structures and creating the organic biomass that the marker needs to sustain a large-scale infection event. Each type corresponds to a function in the larger harvesting process. This is remarkably similar to how Ophiocordyceps manages its reproductive cycle through different stages. The fungus does not only produce one type of structure, it produces mycelial networks that spread through the host's body and do different things depending on where they are located. The networks that colonize muscle tissue produce the behavioral manipulation compounds. The networks that form the fruiting body are structured specifically for spore dispersal, shaped and oriented to release spores at the optimal trajectory for landing on ants below. Different parts of the system do different things, and each thing they do serves a specific stage of the overall process. The marker's necromorphs are the same. The variety is not chaos. It is a division of labor, operating at the scale of a planetary infestation, with each type of transformed body assigned to the task it is biochemically optimized for. The infector form deserves particular attention. It was, according to the logs from the early Aegis 7 research, among the first necromorphs to be created by the marker signal in controlled settings. Its function is singular and extraordinarily effective. The infector seeks out fresh corpses and injects a concentration of necromorph tissue directly into the host's skull, triggering immediate transformation. In a standard outbreak, the infector is the accelerant. It transforms corpses faster than the baseline signal could do on its own, dramatically shortening the timeline between a death event and the creation of new necromorphs from the resulting bodies. The infector is the equivalent of the fungal spore landing directly on a new ant rather than drifting down through the air column. Direct contact, immediate initiation, maximum efficiency. What the necromorphs collectively accomplish is the generation and management of biomass. Every body they create from a living target is added to the pool. Every body they gather through direct infection is added to the pool. The pool of reanimated biomass grows, under the marker's direction, until it reaches the threshold required for convergence to begin. There is one detail in this process that tends to go unremarked, and it is the detail that most clearly reveals the marker as a biological system rather than a weapon. The marker protects itself from its own necromorphs, the area immediately surrounding the marker. What the Dead Space lore describes as a dead space field inhibits the necromorphs. They cannot approach the marker directly. In the early stages of an outbreak, when the field is active, the necromorphs spread through everything around the marker but leave the marker itself in a kind of eye of the storm stillness. This has a precise biological function. If the necromorphs were allowed to gather at the marker before sufficient biomass had been accumulated, they would trigger a premature convergence, producing a smaller and weaker result than a fully developed event would generate. The marker is managing the timing of its own reproduction. It is preventing its own systems from acting too early, ensuring that the harvest is complete before the gathering begins. A tree holds its fruit until the seeds inside are ready to germinate. The marker holds its necromorphs at a distance until the biomass is sufficient to produce a viable result. When the threshold is reached, the dead space field collapses. The The Necromorphs, responding to the marker's signal, gather at its base, and the last phase of the life cycle begins. This is the phase that the games call the Convergence event. It is the phase that unitologists believe is ascension. It is the phase that every human civilization in the Dead Space universe has experienced as extinction, and it is in the framework this video has been building toward: birth. Not the birth of humanity, the birth of something else entirely. The thing that gets born is worth spending some time on, because understanding what a Brethren moon actually is, not as a monster but as a biological entity, is the point where the Ophiocordyceps analogy reaches its most complete and most chilling form. But before we get there is something that needs to be addressed, something the marker does that has not been fully examined yet, something that no other biological system in the natural world does on anything close to this scale. The marker builds its own worshippers. Chapter 6: The Builders. When Michael Altman died, the people who killed him needed a story. The knowledge of the black marker's existence had already escaped. The signal from the crater had been documented. Too many researchers had too much information for a simple suppression to work. What the government and corporate entities that had been controlling the marker research needed was a way to manage the narrative, to give the public a framework for understanding the marker that served the system's interests rather than undermining them. What they built was a religion. Unitology was founded on Michael Altman's image and his documented experiences with the black marker. The specifics of how his martyrdom was shaped and distributed are laid out in the expanded lore, but the essential mechanism is straightforward. The same signal that drove other people around the marker into paranoia and violence had given Altman something that looked, from the outside, like prophetic insight. His ability to approach the marker without immediate psychological collapse, combined with the genuine coherence of some of what he had written about the marker's signal, gave his writings the texture of revelation. A new prophet, a new sacred text, a new promise. The promise was convergence. The signal would make humanity whole. Death was not an ending but a transition. The marker was the instrument of human completion, of universal unity, of the ascension everyone somewhere already feared they might be missing. Unitology spread because it offered exactly what an energy-depleted, resource-strained, institutionally cynical humanity was looking for: a reason, a direction, a certainty, a community of people who had found the answer when the secular institutions around them kept failing to produce one. Within a few generations, Unitology had become the most powerful religious organization in the known human universe, and everything it asked of its members, everything it organized its doctrine around, served the marker's reproductive needs directly. The Church of Unitology believed the markers were sacred. Protecting them, therefore, was a spiritual obligation. Studying them was a devotional practice. Replicating them was, for the most devout and technically capable members, the highest possible service to the faith. The red markers, the man-made copies of the black marker, were built by human hands, guided by human brains, that had been gradually shaped by the marker's signal into understanding its replication codes. The Church did not know it was building the marker's offspring. It believed it was building monuments to the divine. This is, when examined from the outside, one of the most extraordinary examples of behavioral manipulation in the entire Dead Space lore. The marker does not simply manipulate individuals, it shapes cultures, it creates institutions, it builds the social infrastructure required to ensure its replication across an entire civilization's territory, using the civilization's own religious impulses as the engine. Think about what a religion does. At a structural level, it creates communities organized around a shared set of beliefs and practices. It creates institutions that protect and propagate those beliefs. It creates a motivation structure that can override individual self-interest in service of the collective belief system. It creates an identity for its members that is tied to the continuation of the practices the religion prescribes. And it creates a mechanism for transmission across generations, so that the beliefs and practices continue long after the founding generation is gone. All of these structural features of religion serve the marker's needs precisely. The unitologists protect the markers from destruction. They build new ones wherever they have the technical capability to do so. They resist institutional efforts to suppress marker research. They transmit the marker signal in encoded form through every ritual and teaching of their faith, ensuring that even people who have never been in physical proximity to a marker have been exposed at a cultural level to its influence. The marker built a delivery system for its own ideas. It built that system from the human instinct for meaning in the face of mortality. In psychology, terror management theory describes how awareness of death shapes human behavior at the deepest level. Humans know they are going to die. This knowledge is a constant, low-level source of anxiety that most people manage through the cultural systems around them. The belief in an afterlife, the sense that their work or their children or their community will persist after they are gone, the feeling that life has meaning that transcends individual death. The marker's promise of convergence is a perfect terror management solution. It tells its believers that death is not extinction but integration, that the individual consciousness is not lost but incorporated into something larger and more permanent, that the fear of dying is simply a failure to understand what dying actually means. This promise is, from a purely psychological standpoint, extraordinarily effective. It addresses the deepest source of human anxiety directly, personally, in the same register that makes religious belief so powerful. And it does so while simultaneously guiding its believers toward the behaviors the marker needs. Worship the markers, build the markers, protect the markers, spread the faith. Do not resist convergence when it comes. The marker did not need to design this deliberately. It only needed to produce a signal whose effects on human neurology happen to generate, across a population, the kind of religious community that serves its life cycle. Over enough time, operating on enough minds, the signal's effects sorted out into a social structure that was optimally suited for marker propagation. Natural selection does not design, it selects. What it selects for, in an environment where a signal is operating on a large population, is whatever behavior cluster happens to serve that signal's reproductive success. Unitology is not the marker's plan. Unitology is the marker's most successful evolutionary product. And the red markers that unitologists and government researchers built, those copies scattered across colonies throughout human-controlled space, each one broadcasting the same signal, each one producing the same cascade of effects at its location, each one waiting for the biomass around it to reach the threshold, are the seeds. The black marker on Earth was one seed. The red markers built by humanity were hundreds more. By the time of Dead Space 3, those seeds had spread to nearly every major human colony in the known galaxy. The marker had done what the Brethren moon that seeded Earth intended. It had guided a species from discovery to replication. From a single artifact buried under 65 million years of sediment, to a civilization covering its own worlds in copies of the thing that would end it. The ant has reached the leaf. Its mandibles are locked. The fruiting body is about to emerge. But what comes next is not simply death. What comes next is the part that nobody talks about, the part that the lore reveals only if you follow it to its conclusion, past the individual games, past the individual crisis events, out to the cosmic scale where the whole system becomes visible. What comes next is birth on a scale that makes the word apocalypse seem small, and it begins with everything the marker has gathered, rising into the sky. If you are still with us, we are about to reach the part where everything connects. Stay close. Chapter 7: The Fruiting Body. There is a planet called Tau Volantis, and the thing orbiting it should not exist. It is a moon-sized organism, half-formed, frozen in the moment of its own birth, locked in ice by a machine that an alien civilization built at enormous cost to itself when it realized what was happening, and found, almost too late, a way to stop it. The creature hanging above Tau Volantis is not the thing that killed the civilization below. The civilization below killed itself, building the machine that stopped the creature from being born. This distinction matters. It is one of the most important pieces of information Dead Space 3 contains. and it tends to get overshadowed by the scale of what you are looking at when you see it. But before we reach Tau Volantis, we need to understand what convergence actually is, not what unitologists believe it is, not what the characters experiencing it in real time perceive it to be, what it actually is as a biological process. When you strip away the religious framing and the horror of the experience and look at the underlying mechanism, convergence is reproduction. When the marker's dead space field collapses, when the necromorphs gather at the base of the marker, when the electromagnetic pulse begins and the strange vortex forms, what is happening is a reproductive event of a scale the human mind was not built to easily comprehend. The marker generates a powerful upward force. The necromorphs, the reformed and reanimated biomass that the outbreak has been generating, are drawn upward into the stratosphere, the dead tissue of every creature the outbreak has processed. Every body the signal has transformed rises toward a central point above the marker. Rocky fragments of the surrounding structure, soil, and mineral matter are pulled up alongside the organic material. The organic and inorganic merge in the stratosphere. The necrotic flesh, the billions of transformed cells that were once living beings, begins to assemble into a coherent structure. The rock and mineral matter forms a shell around the organic core. The structure grows, it organizes, it begins, over what the lore implies is a period of time compressed by the marker's immense energetic output, to develop the characteristics of an independent living entity. A brethren moon is born. The parallel to Ophiocordyceps becomes, at this point, as precise as a biological analogy can be between two wildly different scales. The fungus uses the ant's body as the substrate from which a fruiting body grows. The dead ant, positioned at exactly the right elevation, becomes the launching platform for the stalk and the spores. The ant's biomass is not simply discarded, it is repurposed into the architecture of the next stage of the fungus's life cycle. The marker uses the biomass of an entire planetary population the same way. The billions of dead bodies gathered through the outbreak are not destroyed, they are incorporated. They become the raw organic material from which the Brethren Moon's flesh is built. Every individual who died in the colony outbreak, every creature transformed by the necromorph infection, every cell of living tissue that the outbreak processed contributes to the body of the thing that rises. The Brethren Moon is built from the civilization that hosted the marker. Unitologists called this unity, this becoming whole. The language is not wrong, technically. The biological material of millions of beings does become unified in convergence, just not in a way that preserves anything recognizable about any of them. On Tau Volantis, the alien civilization that encountered the black marker did what most intelligent species apparently do upon discovery of a marker. They studied it, they built copies. The signal spread, the necromorph infection spread, the bodies accumulated, and convergence began. The difference between Tau Volantis and every other world where convergence completed is that the surviving members of this civilization had enough warning, enough scientific understanding, and enough collective will to build a machine capable of interfering with the process. The machine is, in the logic of the Dead Space universe, a remarkable achievement. It did not destroy the forming moon. The moon was too far along for destruction to be straightforward. What it did instead was freeze the planet and halt the convergence mid-event. The half-formed moon was locked in orbit, alive but incomplete, broadcasting through the marker network a signal that the lore renders as the phrase that echoes through the games, "Turn it off." The moon above Tau Volantis was not asking for mercy. It was not experiencing suffering in any way the word suggests human pain. It was issuing a functional directive. The machine was preventing convergence from completing. The moon needed someone to disable the machine so that the reproductive event it had been arrested in the middle of could finish. The alien civilization that built the machine, those people, their world, their history, everything they were, froze alongside their creation. They chose this. They chose to stop the moon even at the cost of their world, knowing that the machine required their presence to maintain itself. This is the act that Dr. Earl Serrano, the researcher whose logs Isaac Clarke finds scattered through Tau Volantis' ruins, dedicated his life to understanding. Serrano traced the machine's operation. He understood its purpose, and in doing so he discovered something about Tau Volantis that the alien civilization had left encoded in the machine's design. The machine was not simply a freezing device. With the right configuration, with the information stored in a device called the Codex, the machine could do more than hold the moon in stasis. It could destroy it. The aliens had left a key. They had built a lock that could also be a weapon, and then frozen themselves in place as guardians of it, knowing that eventually someone else would find what they had left behind. What Serrano also discovered, and what his logs convey with a particular weight, was the scale of what he was looking at. Tau Volantis was not a unique event. The moon above Tau Volantis was one moon among many. There was a network of them, spanning the galaxy, connected through the same signal that connects the markers on planetary surfaces. A galaxy-spanning organism of sorts, built from the civilizations that had hosted convergence events across billions of years of cosmic time. The fruiting body of the zombie ant fungus releases spores, hundreds of thousands of them, raining down from a single dead ant locked onto a single leaf in a single forest. The Brethren moons do the same, and the mechanism by which they do it is the most elegant and horrifying detail in the entire Dead Space lore. A completed Brethren moon, after it has finished feeding on the remaining life at its birth world, produces new black markers. The method appears to involve a form of keratinization, the same biological process by which a human body produces hair and nails, but operating at a cosmic scale. The moon grows the black markers from its own structure and ejects them into space, where they travel at sublight speeds toward whatever worlds lie along viable trajectories, the moon raining black markers across the void, spores raining down from a dead ant locked onto a leaf. Different scales, same principle, same ruthless efficiency, same complete indifference to anything that might be in the way. The fruiting body does not choose where its spores land. The wind carries them. Some land on ants, some land on dirt, some land on bark and never develop. The ratio does not matter, because the fruiting body produces enough spores that the probability of some finding viable hosts is effectively certain. The Brethren moons do not choose which worlds receive black markers. Orbital mechanics and distance govern the trajectories. Some markers land on worlds that never develop intelligent life. Some land on worlds where life develops but never reaches the technological complexity required to detect and interact with a marker. Some land on worlds like Earth, where millions of years of waiting produces exactly the kind of civilization the system needs. The ratio does not matter, because the moons have been doing this long enough that the number of successful seedings in the sheer span of geological time is effectively unlimited. This is the system. This is what the markers are doing on every world they land on. This is what every necromorph outbreak, every act of marker-induced psychosis, every unitologist's devotion is ultimately in service of, not malice, not destruction for its own sake, birth, reproduction, the perpetuation of the most successful biological cycle in the known universe. Now here is the detail that nothing in the game states directly, but that the lore points towards so clearly that it is difficult to look away from once you have seen it. The Brethren Moon Network is intelligent. The moons communicate. They share information across the galaxy through the same signal that the markers broadcast on planetary surfaces. When the Tau Volantis moon was briefly reawakened in Dead Space 3 before Isaac Clarke managed to destroy it, it used that reawakening to contact the other moons, to tell them about Earth. Earth, the last source of biological material large enough to feed them all. The other moons turned toward it immediately. We will come back to what that means in full. But first, there is a question that the existence of the Brethren Moon Network forces us to ask. A question that the lore gestures toward, but that tends to make people deeply uncomfortable when they follow it to its conclusion. If the moons have been doing this for billions of years, consuming civilization after civilization across the galaxy, launching new markers, repeating the cycle, then by the time the black marker arrived on Earth 65 million years ago, how many civilizations had already gone through convergence? The answer, based on what Dr. Serrano concludes from his research on Tau Volantis, is not reassuring, and that answer changes the entire question of what humanity actually is. Chapter 8: The Spore Network. The galaxy is estimated to contain between 100 billion and 400 billion stars. Of those, a significant fraction have planetary systems. Of those, a fraction have planets in what astronomers call the habitable zone, where liquid water can exist and complex chemistry becomes possible. The numbers are large enough that even a very small probability of life developing on any given world produces, over geological timescales, a large number of worlds where life has appeared. The Dead Space universe does not contradict any of this. What it adds is something more specific: the number of worlds where intelligent life has appeared. The number of species that have reached the technological complexity required to discover and study a black marker is not merely large. It is, based on the lore's internal logic, the number of brethren moons that exist in the galaxy's network. Every moon is a dead civilization. Each one of those massive, flesh and rock organisms drifting through the void was born from a convergence event that consumed a world's entire population. Each one carries, in its physical structure, the molecular remnants of billions of individual beings who lived, thought, built things, loved things, feared things, and were ultimately processed into the body of the entity that now drifts alongside its kin in the dark between stars. The network they form is not merely a communication system. It is a historical record of extinction. Every species that ever developed enough intelligence to find a marker, build copies of it, and fail to stop what came next is represented somewhere in the network's sprawling, telepathic web. The moons share information across this network, coordinating, identifying new targets, broadcasting the marker signal forward to new worlds. Buckle's research on Tau Volantis led him to a conclusion he documented with the kind of flatness that tends to come over people when they have absorbed something genuinely catastrophic. Humanity, by the time of Dead Space 3, appeared to be the last surviving intelligent species in the galaxy. Every other civilization that had ever been complex enough to trigger the marker's reproductive cycle had already been processed. The network of moons that had accumulated over billions of years represented a galaxy that had been systematically harvested. Earth was not a target among many. It was the last one. This is the scale at which the Ophiocordyceps analogy has to be understood. The zombie ant fungus, operating in a single forest, uses the ant colony as a resource base. It does not consume the entire forest. There are ecological checks. There are other species competing for the same space. There are environmental pressures that limit how far any single organism's reproductive success can extend. The Brethren Moon Network has no such checks. An ant colony can move. It can relocate away from a heavy fungal infection zone. It can develop behavioral adaptations that reduce exposure. Some ant colonies have been observed to carry infected members away from the group before the fungal manipulation reaches its behavioral manipulation stage, a kind of social immune response. The Ophiocordyceps ant system has co-evolved for long enough that the ants have some countermeasures, imperfect but real. The galaxy's civilizations had no co-evolutionary relationship with the marker system. Each encounter was fresh. Each species arrived at the marker without any cultural or biological memory of what it was or what it did. The marker system, by contrast, had been doing this for billions of years. Every new civilization it encountered was naive. Every new population of intelligent beings was encountering the signal for the first time, with no framework for what was happening to them. The alien civilization on Tau Volantis is notable precisely because they are an exception. They encountered the marker, experienced the beginning of convergence, and somehow, at great cost, managed to build a defense. Serrano theorized that the machine they built may have been possible because the aliens had access to some information about the marker's nature that other civilizations lacked. Perhaps because they had discovered remnants or records from an even earlier species. The lore does not confirm this directly. What it does confirm is that the Tau Volantis civilization is one of the only known examples of a species that encountered the marker system and survived long enough to resist it, even if that survival ultimately took the form of a civilization frozen in place rather than one that continued to grow and develop. The moons, meanwhile, continued their cycle. Each completed moon adds to the network. Each addition to the network increases the network's total intelligence and its capacity to coordinate future seedings. A young brethren moon, newly birthed from a convergence event, presumably has a narrow awareness. An old moon, one that has fed, launched new markers, entered the torpor that the lore describes as a dormant but alert state, has been part of the network for a long time and shares in its accumulated knowledge. The network as a whole is learning. It has been learning for billions of years. It knows the trajectory of civilizations. It knows how long a given type of star system takes to produce the right conditions for intelligence. It knows how civilizations respond to energy crises, because it has seen thousands of civilizations respond to energy crises in the same way, by following the marker's apparent promise of limitless power. The system's understanding of intelligent behavior across the full range of species it has processed is effectively complete. This is why the marker's manipulation works so reliably. The signal does not produce random effects. It produces effects that reliably generate the outcomes the system needs, because the system has been refined across billions of years of interaction with intelligent minds. Every adjustment to the signal's mechanism that improved the reproductive success of the overall life cycle was selected for. Everything that worked was kept. Everything that did not was discarded. The marker's manipulation of human psychology, the way it maps the signal's effects to specific neurological profiles, the way it identifies and guides the most compatible individuals while driving the less compatible ones toward violence, the way it generates a religious community that protects and replicates the markers, all of this represents the accumulated learning of a system that has been doing this for longer than complex life has existed on Earth. The fungus that infects an ant today is not the same organism that first infected an ant millions of years ago. It is a refined, highly specific product of evolutionary pressure, adapted to the precise biochemistry of its current host species across a long coevolutionary history. Ophiocordyceps and the ants it targets have been shaping each other for so long that the fungus's manipulation and the ant's response are almost perfectly matched. The marker system and the civilizations it targets have not co-evolved. The civilizations are always new. The system is always ancient. The asymmetry is total. The moons carry the memory. The new civilization arrives without any. Now here is the detail that takes the spine of this entire argument and drives it somewhere the games themselves approach but do not fully articulate. If the black marker arrived on Earth 65 million years ago, and if the signal it has been broadcasting since then appears to have guided the evolution of specific primate lineages toward intelligence, then the question of what the marker did to humanity is not only a question about what happened after the black marker was discovered in the 23rd century. The question goes all the way back to the mammals that survived the extinction event, and began the long diversification that eventually produced the primate lineages that led to human beings. The question is not just, what is the marker doing to us now? The question is, what has the marker been doing to us all along? And what it has been doing, the answer the lore implies without stating directly, is exactly what the Ophiocordyceps fungus does to the ant colony in the forest. Not attacking it, not destroying it, growing it. Chapter 9. What Humans Were For. There is a hypothesis embedded in the Dead Space lore that tends to make people who notice it deeply uncomfortable, and the discomfort is worth sitting with rather than pushing past. The hypothesis is this: the black marker that arrived on Earth 65 million years ago did not simply wait for intelligent life to develop. The signal it has been broadcasting since then influenced the development of intelligent life on Earth. The lore does not confirm this as absolute fact. It presents it as a strong possibility, one that the in-universe researchers who examined the black marker found compelling enough to document. The marker's electromagnetic signal, operating at the biological frequencies that influence neural development, may have been doing something to the evolutionary trajectory of primate cognition for a very long time. not directing specific mutations. The mechanism does not work that way, but creating an environmental pressure that's selected for certain kinds of neurological complexity. The marker may have been cultivating its own harvest. This is not a metaphor. In the natural world, organisms that depend on other organisms for their life cycle sometimes cultivate the host population actively. The fig tree and the fig wasp have a relationship so interdependent that neither can reproduce without the other. Certain orchid species produce compounds that mimic insect pheromones to attract specific pollinators. The yucca plant and the yucca moth exist in an obligate mutualism where each species depends on the other's survival. These are not predator-prey relationships. They are cultivation relationships. One organism shapes the behavior and sometimes the biology of another, not out of hostility, but because the other organism's existence in a particular form serves the first organism's reproductive needs. The marker may have cultivated humanity the way an orchid cultivates a pollinator. The signal appears to have done something specific. The marker's signal, in its long wavelength, low-frequency form, appears to have influenced primate brain development in ways that selected for higher general intelligence, language capacity, abstract reasoning, and perhaps most specifically, the kind of symbolic thinking that allows a species to study an artifact covered in an alien language and eventually make sense of it. These are the cognitive traits that allow an intelligent species to find a marker, recognize it as significant, study it, and build copies. They are also the cognitive traits that separate humanity from every other species that currently exists on Earth. If the marker was selecting for these traits, it was selecting for the specific cognitive profile that makes a species maximally useful for its reproductive purposes. It was, over millions of years, optimizing its future builders. The ant that Ophiocordyceps targets is not random. The fungus is highly host-specific. Each species of Ophiocordyceps targets one specific ant species and cannot infect others. This specificity is not coincidental. It is the result of millions of years of co-evolutionary refinement, during which the fungus became precisely adapted to the biochemistry of its chosen host. The manipulation compounds the fungus produces are calibrated to the neurochemistry of that specific ant species. A different ant would not respond the same way. The marker arrived on Earth and waited. Then it selected. Over millions of years, it may have been calibrating its future hosts toward the specific neurological profile that would make them maximally useful as marker builders. Humanity emerged from this process as what the Dead Space lore in one of its most striking phrases calls a herald species, a civilization that does not simply encounter the marker and fall to it, but that builds copies of it, distributes those copies across its own territory, and in doing so plants the seeds of its own eventual processing across every world it inhabits. Isaac Clarke is described in the lore as a herald of the markers, an individual whose brain's compatibility with the marker's signal makes him not a victim of the system but a tool of it, his resistance to the signal's most destructive effects, his capacity to understand the marker's language, his ability to survive situations that kill everyone around him. All of this reflects a genetic compatibility that the marker identified and utilized. But Isaac is not special because of personal merit or heroism. He is special because his brain is precisely the kind of brain the marker's system needs to carry forward its replication codes. His survival is not a victory for humanity. It is a function. He is kept alive because he is useful. The marker does not spare him out of anything resembling mercy. It spares him the way the ant colony is spared by the fungus, right up until the moment the fungus needs it to die in a specific position on a specific leaf. This reframe is genuinely uncomfortable. Isaac Clarke, across 3 games of horror survival and desperate resistance, is one of the most iconic figures in the genre. Framing him as a biological tool, as a herald shaped for the marker's purposes by millions of years of evolutionary pressure, strips away the heroism and leaves something cold and strange in its place. A man who survived not because he was the right person, but because he had the right DNA. A man whose resistance in the end may have only served to accelerate the system he thought he was fighting. But this is what the lore implies, and it is the same logic that governs the ant. The ant does not know it is being cultivated. It does not know that the forest it forages through is shaped, in subtle ways, by the evolutionary pressure of the fungus that depends on it. It does not know that its neurochemistry has been a selection target for millions of years. It lives its ant life, forages its foraging trails, maintains its colony, and does not experience any of this as manipulation. The manipulation is deeper than experience. It is written into what the ant is. The manipulation of humanity by the marker is written into what we are. Not as individuals, as a species. The cognitive traits that make us capable of science and religion and technology and symbolic reasoning. The traits that make us feel unique and purposeful in the universe may be, at least in part, the cultivated product of a millions of years long project aimed at producing a reliable host species for a biological cycle that was already ancient when our ancestors were still small mammals hiding from dinosaurs. This is the detail that makes the whole argument crazy. The marker being evil is a manageable concept. Evil can be resisted. Evil can be opposed on moral grounds. Evil is, at least in some sense, in relationship with us. It notices us. It hates us. It considers us worth destroying. A system that cultivated us is something else entirely. A system that cultivated us does not hate us. It does not notice us in any individual sense. We are to the marker system what the ant colony is to Ophiocordyceps, a resource base, a biological substrate. A population that exists in the form it exists in because that form serves the system's needs. The existential weight of this is real, and it is worth letting it sit for a moment without rushing past it, because the Dead Space games, in their horror, ask you to experience the terror of the Necromorphs, the claustrophobia of the corridors, the grief of Isaac's story. All of this is genuine and well crafted, but underneath all of it is this quieter and more total horror. The possibility that our whole existence, our intelligence, our civilization, our capacity for science and art and religion was a project, a cultivation, an optimization process aimed at producing the most efficient possible herald species for a biological cycle we were never meant to understand. The fungus does not tell the ant what it is. The marker for 65 million years did not need to tell us anything at all. It just waited, and we became exactly what it needed. That would be enough of a thought to end on. But the story does not end there, because there is one more layer to the marker's operation that we have not examined yet, a layer that involves what the moons do after Convergence completes, and what it means that the moons by the time of Dead Space 3 are apparently starving. The network is hungry. Earth is the last populated world, and the moons that have been drifting in the dark between stars, waiting for new sources of biomass, are turning toward us all at once. What does it mean to be the last food in a galaxy that has been eaten empty? That question is where this analysis goes next, and the answer involves something about the marker system that the games hint at but never quite say out loud. Something about what the marker signals were still broadcasting even after most of the civilizations that built them were gone. Something that suggests the marker's hunger is not simply a function of need, it is a function of design. Chapter 10: What the Aliens Left Behind. The civilization that once inhabited Tau Volantis had no name, at least none that survived into any form the humans who eventually found their ruins could read. The planet itself was named by the humans who cataloged it. The beings who built the sprawling underground cities beneath the ice were identified only through what they left behind. Engineering diagrams, biological specimens preserved in the deep freeze, records of a people who understood exactly what was happening to them and chose to do something about it, at the cost of everything they had. Dr. Samuel Serrano spent years on Tau Volantis piecing together their story. His logs, scattered through the ruins that Isaac Clarke eventually navigates, trace the arc of a scientist who arrived on the planet looking for answers about the marker signal, and gradually, over the course of years of isolation and obsessive research, assembled a picture of the universe that he could not share with anyone who would believe him. What Serrano found tells us more about the marker system's full life cycle than anything the games state directly. It also tells us something about the moons that complicates the analogy to the zombie ant fungus in a way that makes the whole picture considerably darker. The alien civilization on Tau Volantis discovered their version of the black marker, in the same way humanity discovered its own. The signal drew them in, the promise of energy drew them closer. The replication codes embedded in the signal eventually guided the most compatible individuals toward building copies. Red markers, or whatever the alien equivalent was, spread across their territory. The infection spread, the deaths accumulated, convergence began. But the surviving members of this civilization did something that, according to Serrano's research, no other species had managed to do before them. They studied the process carefully enough to understand what was happening while it was still happening. They did not simply try to destroy the markers, which the lore implies is not straightforward in any case. They designed around the problem. The machine they built was not a weapon against the marker in any direct sense. It was a disruption device. It interrupted the convergence event mid-process by altering the environmental conditions of the entire planet, dropping the temperature catastrophically, and locking the forming moon in place before it could fully coalesce. The cost was the civilization itself. The survivors of the outbreak did not evacuate, they stayed. Someone had to maintain the machine, and the machine's maintenance required a continuous biological presence on the planet. The lore does not explain precisely how this maintenance worked, or how many of the aliens survived long enough to see the machine succeed. What the frozen ruins suggest is that the machine worked exactly as designed, and the designers knew they would not survive to see a recovery. They built a solution. They chose to be the price of it. Serrano found, buried in the aliens' records, a detail that he describes in one of his logs with a quietness that suggests he had been sitting with it for a long time before writing it down. The machine had a second configuration, not just a freeze function, but a destruction function. With the right configuration, using the information stored in the codex the aliens had built specifically for this purpose, the machine could do more than hold the Tau Volantis moon in stasis. It could annihilate it. The aliens had not simply stopped the process, they had left the tools to finish it. Serrano concluded that this was intentional. The aliens had prepared for the possibility that someone else might come along, find the ruins, understand what they were looking at, and be able to use what had been left behind. The codex was the key, the machine was the lock, and the entire arrangement, preserved under the ice of a frozen planet, was a message addressed to the next species that encountered the marker system and survived long enough to come looking for answers. The message was, "We could not finish this alone. Here is what you need to do it." Whether the alien civilization knew that another species would eventually find their ruins is something Serrano does not speculate about. He was not that kind of scientist. He documented what could be documented and left inference to others. What he did speculate about was the number of convergence events that must have occurred before Tau Volantis. Based on the size and apparent age of the Brethren Moon network, he was able to infer from the signal data he collected on the planet. His calculations were not optimistic. The network was vast. The moons appeared to have been accumulating for far longer than any human civilization had existed. The number of species that must have gone through convergence before humanity, each one contributing another moon to the network, was high enough that Serrano spent several log entries working through what it meant that humanity had apparently not yet encountered another living intelligent species in the universe. What it meant was already becoming clear to him before he finished the calculation. There were no other living intelligent species to encounter. The galaxy had been systematically emptied. Serrano's final conclusion, stated without dramatic emphasis in one of his last recorded logs, was this: humanity appeared to be the last remaining population of intelligent life in the Milky Way galaxy. Every other civilization that had ever developed the complexity required to find and interact with a marker had already been processed. The moons that had accumulated from these countless convergence events were now starving. They had consumed their birth worlds, fed on the remaining biospheres, launched new black markers into space, and then entered the torpor state the lore describes as dormant but alert, dormant but hungry. The markers that were still active, the ones seated on uninhabited worlds or worlds where no suitable civilization had yet developed, were still broadcasting, still waiting, but the yield from those seeds had become increasingly sparse as the viable worlds were used up. The network was contracting toward its last available resource, Earth. The moons did not know where Earth was when Dead Space 3 begins. The signal from the active markers on human-colonized worlds was detectable by the network, but Earth's precise location within the galaxy, the location of the central population that the markers were pointing back toward, was not yet in the network's possession. This is why the moon above Tau Volantis was so significant, not merely because it was an incomplete moon being kept from finishing its own birth by an alien machine, but because its reawakening, even briefly, allowed it to contact the rest of the network and share what it had learned from the humans who had come to Tau Volantis. It learned where Earth was. It shared that information before Isaac Clarke and John Carver managed to destroy it. The final scene of Dead Space 3, with Isaac and Carver standing on the frozen surface of what remains of Tau Volantis, while the red glow of multiple Brethren moons rises over Tau Volantis in the distance, is not simply a horror image. It is the completion of a biological sequence that began 65 million years ago, when an asteroid punched through the atmosphere above the Gulf of Mexico and deposited something into the crater it left behind. The seed was planted. The crop was grown. The harvest has come. What makes this moment, in the context of everything this analysis has been building toward, so much more affecting than the straightforward horror reading is this: the moons are not invading. They are not attacking in any military sense. They are arriving in the way locusts arrive at a field that has been growing all season. The field did not grow in ignorance of the locusts. The field was, in some sense, grown by the same system that produced the locusts. The crop and the harvest are part of the same cycle. The moons are not our enemies. They are the end stage of a process we were built for. And here is where the Dead Space lore reaches the limit of what it can say within the framework of a game. Because the next question, the one that naturally follows from everything Serrano found and everything the marker system reveals about itself, is not a question about survival strategies or weapon effectiveness or how to stop the moons. It is a philosophical question, a psychological question, a question about what we do with a horror that is not interested in us as people, not threatened by our resistance, not moved by our suffering. What do you do with a universe that is not against you but that built you for a purpose you were never meant to know? That question is where the most important chapter of this analysis begins. Chapter 11, The Monster We Needed. There is a psychological framework developed by researchers Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pischensky that attempts to explain why humans behave the way they do in the face of their own mortality. The framework is called Terror Management Theory, and its central argument is deceptively simple. Human beings are unique among animals in their conscious awareness of their own death. And this awareness creates a persistent, low-level terror that shapes virtually every aspect of human culture, behavior, and belief. Mortality awareness is not just a fact we carry around, it is an active pressure on the psyche that requires constant management. The management strategies humans have developed across every culture in recorded history share a common architecture. They all attempt to answer the same question: if I am going to die and disappear, what makes my existence meaningful anyway? The answers vary: belief in an afterlife, legacy through children, or creative work, membership in a group whose values and traditions will outlast the individual, the conviction that a divine intelligence created and cares about each human life. These are not simply comfort mechanisms, they are psychological infrastructure, essential to the functioning of a being that knows it will cease to exist. Terror management theory predicts something specific about how people respond to things that threaten this psychological infrastructure. When the cultural worldview that gives life meaning is challenged, humans do not respond rationally. They double down on the belief, they demonize the challenger. They may become more aggressive toward people who see the world differently, because an alternative worldview is an implicit threat to the meaning-making system that keeps the terror of death at arm's length. Now apply this to the marker. If the marker system is exactly what this analysis has argued it is, a biological cycle operating with cold efficiency and complete indifference to anything that might be in its path, then confronting it clearly produces a specific terror management problem. A universe where an indifferent biological system has been cultivating humanity as a food crop for billions of years is a universe in which human life has no meaning that the universe recognizes. The suffering, the love, the art, the science, the religion, the everything that human beings have built and experienced and lost, none of it registers as significant within the marker's operation. We are substrate. We are raw material. The thing that drives the marker's cycle does not know we tell stories. This is categorically more terrifying than the alternative. A malicious intelligence that wants to destroy humanity is, in the vocabulary of human meaning-making, comprehensible. We have thousands of years of narrative and theological and philosophical frameworks for understanding an enemy. An enemy implies a relationship. An enemy implies that we matter enough to be worth destroying. An enemy at some level sees us. The marker system does not see us. This is why across every level of the Dead Space universe, the characters and institutions that encounter the markers consistently frame them in terms of intentional evil. EarthGov frames the marker as a weapon that can be controlled. The Church of Unitology frames it as a divine intelligence with a plan for human salvation. The researchers who study it tend to frame it as a mind that is, in some sense, in communication with them. Even Isaac Clarke, whose experience with the marker is the most intimate and most damaging of any character in the series, relates to the marker through the hallucination of Nicole, through a relationship, through something that has a face and a voice and an emotional register that places it within the range of human experience. The alternative, understanding the marker as a biological mechanism that produces Nicole's image the way a fly trap produces the smell of flowers, is a comprehension that human psychology tends to resist, not because people are stupid, but because the terror management implications of that comprehension are nearly unmanageable. If the marker is a biological mechanism, then there is no one to negotiate with, no one to appeal to, no one whose understanding of the situation might be changed by the right argument or the right act of resistance. The marker does not know it is being resisted. The marker does not know Isaac Clarke exists in any individual sense. The marker's system simply continues operating, sorting, harvesting, reproducing, in the same way it has operated for billions of years across hundreds of civilizations, and the fact that one engineer from a planet called Earth managed to destroy a moon does not register as a loss in any meaningful way to the network as a whole. The network has hundreds of moons. Losing one to an unexpected countermeasure is, from the system's perspective, the equivalent of a single fruiting body being eaten by a bird before it releases its spores. Unfortunate for that particular spore cluster, irrelevant to the next season's yield, Isaac Clarke's heroism in this frame is a beautiful thing on a human scale and a statistical footnote on the scale of the system he was fighting. This is hard to sit with. It is supposed to be hard to sit with. The Dead Space series, at its best, is horror that operates at the level of implication rather than explicit statement. The games give you necromorphs to fight, and corridors to survive, and a man's grief to inhabit, but underneath all of that, threaded through the lore in pieces that require assembly, is the argument this video has been making. The real horror is not that the marker wants to kill you. The real horror is that the marker does not know you are there. The distinction between a universe that is against you and a universe that is indifferent to you is one of the oldest and most uncomfortable questions in philosophy. Philosophers from Sartre to Camus have argued that the existential challenge of human life is precisely the absence of a cosmic enemy. A cosmos that actively opposed human existence would at least acknowledge it. A cosmos that is simply indifferent, operating by physical and biological laws that have no reference point for human meaning, requires humans to generate their own meaning from scratch, without external validation. But the marker represents a version of this indifference with teeth. It is not simply that the universe does not care. The universe has, in the form of the marker system, built something that will process us when the time comes, using mechanisms that do not require any awareness of us as individuals or even as a species. The indifference is productive. The indifference has a direction, and the direction leads to convergence. There is a specific psychological reason why the people most affected by the marker, the unitologists, reframe this indifference as divine intention. Terror management theory predicts that when people's mortality becomes salient, they will cling more tightly to the meaning-making frameworks that allow them to manage that terror. The marker's signal makes mortality extremely salient. The hallucinations it produces frequently involve images of death. The depression and paranoia it induces erode the normal social and cognitive buffers that usually keep mortality awareness manageable. A person under these conditions who encounters the marker's promise of convergence, the suggestion that death is not extinction but transformation, that the individual consciousness is not lost but gathered into something larger and eternal, will tend to find that promise psychologically irresistible, not because they are naive or weak, but because the marker's signal has been systematically dismantling the other meaning-making structures that would normally allow them to resist. The marker creates the terror and then provides the only available relief from it. This is not coincidental. This is the system working. And here is the detail that makes this chapter the most distinctly interpretive section of this entire analysis. The marker does not only create meaning-dependent psychology in its victims, it also creates meaning-dependent psychology in the people who resist it. Think about why we root for Isaac Clarke. Think about why the games feel like genuine horror rather than simply gross imagery. The answer is not just good game design, though the game design is excellent. The answer is that the story is structured to give Isaac's resistance meaning. His journey is framed as heroism. His survival is framed as victory. The destruction of the markers he manages to accomplish, the moon he and Carver destroy at Tau Volantis, is framed as a genuine blow against the system. These framings serve the narrative need for human meaning in the face of cosmic scale. They are the story's version of what the unitologists get from their faith, a framework that makes individual human experience matter within a universe that would otherwise swallow it without notice. What the lore suggests, if you follow it all the way to the ending of Dead Space 3, is that Isaac's victories were real on a human scale and insufficient on a cosmic one. The moon was destroyed, the Earth-facing threat was delayed, but the other moons were awakened in the process. The network learned Earth's location. By the final moments of the game, with the Brethren moons rising over the horizon of Earth's atmosphere, the scale of what one man's resistance could accomplish against a system that has been operating for billions of years becomes clear. He was never going to win the war. He was only ever going to survive long enough to understand what the war actually was. And understanding what the war actually was, seeing the marker as a biological cycle rather than a malicious intelligence, is the thing the game never quite gives Isaac directly. He fights, he survives, he grieves, he resists. But the framework he fights within is always the framework of heroic resistance against intentional evil, because that framework is the only one that makes the fighting bearable. The marker does not need the framework to be true. It simply needs the behavior the framework produces to continue until the harvest is ready. This is the most disturbing thing about the marker as a system, and the most disturbing thing about intelligent life as the marker's target. The meaning we construct to resist the system may be exactly what the system relies on us to construct. The heroism, the faith, the resistance, the community, all of it generates the social complexity and the biological density that the marker needs. A civilization that gave up in the face of cosmic indifference would be a smaller harvest than a civilization that fought with everything it had. Fight or submit, the marker wins the biology. The only escape that has ever worked in the Dead Space universe was the alien machine on Tau Volantis, and even that cost the civilization that built it everything they were. The machine did not save them. It preserved the possibility that the next species to arrive might use what they had left behind to do something more permanent. The question of whether Isaac Clarke and John Carver constituted the next species in the aliens' hopes is one the games leave open. What the games close definitively is any comfortable narrative about the marker being an enemy that can be defeated by individual heroism operating on a human timescale. The marker is too old for that. The system is too complete. The harvest is too close. Something the games never say directly, but that the architecture of the lore supports. The unitologists are not simply deluded, they are responding to the marker's signal in the most psychologically coherent way available to them. They are constructing meaning around an experience that strips meaning away. They are calling a biological mechanism divine because the alternative is confronting a universe that built them for a purpose they were never meant to understand. The people who fight the markers are not more clear-eyed than the people who worship them. Both groups are managing the same terror with different tools. The fighters manage it through agency, through the conviction that resistance matters. The worshippers manage it through acceptance, through the conviction that what comes is not death but transformation. Both responses serve the system. Both responses keep people alive long enough to generate more biomass and more marker copies before the final phase. The only response that does not serve the system is understanding. And understanding in Dead Space comes too late to save the people who achieve it. Serrano understood. He was already frozen in the ruins. Isaac understood, eventually. The moons arrived before that understanding could be put to any use at scale. This is the game's honest account of what it means to discover the truth about a system that has been operating longer than you have existed. The truth does not set you free. It simply shows you the cage from the outside. You are still in the cage. Chapter 12. The Last Light in the Galaxy. There is a moment at the end of Dead Space 3 that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Isaac Clarke and John Carver have survived the destruction of the Tau Volantis moon. They are standing on the frozen surface of a planet that has been a graveyard for an alien civilization for longer than human history, watching the aftermath of the machine's detonation settle across the ruins. The moon's corpse lies across the horizon, massive and still, already beginning to be covered by the planet's constant snowfall. The marker signal, the signal that has been present as a low thrum in the background of every moment of the game, has stopped. For the first time in 3 games, there is quiet. Isaac and Carver talk. It is a brief exchange, informal in the way that conversations between survivors tend to be, stripped of ceremony, aware of its own inadequacy. Isaac says something about having stopped looking for meaning a long time ago, back on the Ishimura. Carver absorbs this. They decide to find a way off the planet and go home. This moment is structured as relief, as the beginning of an earned rest after extraordinary suffering. The marker signal is gone. The moon is dead. They survived. The audience that has been experiencing the game alongside Isaac for 3 installments has been given a moment to breathe. Then the visions begin. The Brethren moons, the network that the destroyed Tau Volantis moon managed to contact before its annihilation, begins speaking, not loudly, not immediately, but the signal is there, different from the marker signal, older and more distributed, pushing images into the minds of both survivors. Images of other moons, drifting, awakening, orienting themselves towards something. The Necromorphs begin reappearing on the planet's surface, not from a local marker but from the broader network's activation of any remaining dormant forms in the area. The quiet was not an ending. It was a pause between one kind of noise and another. When Isaac and Carver finally reach a ship and make the jump toward Earth, the last image of the game carries the full weight of everything the lore has been building toward. Earth hangs in the viewport, blue and calm, exactly as it always appears in the visions the moons have been projecting into compatible minds throughout the series. Then the red glow rises, one moon, then several, then more. The Brethren Moon Network, awakened, oriented, and hungry, arriving in Earth's orbit all at once. The ship's communications pick up screaming before the static takes over. This ending is often read as a cliffhanger, a lead-in to a Dead Space 4 that, as of this video, has not arrived. And it is a cliffhanger in the structural sense of the word, but it is also a completion. It is the marker system's life cycle, as laid out across 3 games and decades of lore, reaching its intended conclusion. The seed arrived 200 million years ago. The crop grew, the harvest has come. The Brethren moons are doing exactly what Brethren moons do. They are not attacking Earth. They are arriving to complete a process that has been running since before the dinosaurs died. The horror of this image is not the scale of the moons. It is the recognition for anyone who has been paying attention to the lore that the moons are not doing something extraordinary, they are doing something ordinary, something they have done countless times before, something the system was designed to make routine. Consider what it means to be the last civilization in the galaxy. Serrano's conclusion was that humanity was alone, that every other species capable of reaching the complexity required to interact with a marker had already gone through convergence and contributed to the Moon network. If this is accurate, then the Moon network converging on Earth is not simply the end of humanity. It is the closing of a cosmic cycle that has consumed every form of complex intelligence that ever existed in this galaxy. After Earth, there is nothing left. After Earth, the moons have no more viable targets, at least not in the Milky Way. Whatever they do next, whether they launch new black markers toward other galaxies, or enter a deep dormancy as their food supply is exhausted, or something else entirely, the lore does not address. What it establishes is the finality of Earth's position. The last light in the galaxy, in the sense that matters to the marker system, is humanity, and the system has found it. The zombie ant fungus does not operate in a galaxy, it operates in a forest, but the principle of resource exhaustion is universal. Any system that depends on a finite resource base will eventually exhaust that base. The Ophiocordyceps species that infects a specific type of ant cannot simply switch to a different host when its preferred host becomes scarce. It is too specialized. Its manipulation compounds are calibrated to one neurochemistry. If the ant population it depends on collapsed entirely, the fungus would face an existential constraint that its evolutionary specialization left it unable to solve. The Brethren Moon Network has specialized itself toward the harvesting of intelligent civilizations, the production of new black markers, the broadcasting of the marker signal at frequencies that affect complex nervous systems, the manipulation of cognitive beings toward building copies. All of it is calibrated to a specific kind of prey. A galaxy emptied of intelligent life is a galaxy where the marker system has run out of the one resource it absolutely requires. The moons are not winning, they are finishing. There is a difference. A win implies a future. A finish implies that the game ends. The marker system, having consumed every civilization in the galaxy, has produced the maximum yield possible from the available resource base. What comes after that is, from the system's perspective, irrelevant. The life cycle continues because life cycles do not stop when resources are exhausted. They wait. The moons enter torpor. The black markers drift toward whatever might emerge in a few billion more years in another corner of the universe. The cycle does not care that it has ended an era. The cycle does not notice the silence it leaves behind. Here is where the Ophiocordyceps parallel reaches its most exact and most disturbing expression. There are locations in tropical forests where Ophiocordyceps outbreaks have reached a kind of saturation point. So many ants have died in a given area that the colony has relocated. The fruiting bodies continue producing spores, but the density of viable hosts has dropped below the threshold required for the infection to maintain its reproductive rate. The fungus does not go extinct. It persists, in reduced numbers, waiting for the host population to recover, because ant colonies, given time and distance from the outbreak zone, will eventually re-establish themselves in new locations. The fungus can wait. Ants recover faster than geological timescales. The moons can wait too, but what recovers on a galactic timescale, if the moons have consumed every existing civilization, and the black markers they launch seed worlds that will take millions of years to develop new intelligent life, is something that will not exist in any form recognizable to the humanity that currently lives on Earth. There is something deeply unsettling about this particular thought that does not resolve neatly into horror or into acceptance. The moons are not ending intelligence, they are resetting the conditions under which intelligence might arise again. The marker's life cycle is not terminal on a cosmic scale, it is cyclical. The galaxy may, in some unimaginably distant future, produce another civilization sophisticated enough to find a black marker and begin the process again. That distant future civilization will find, embedded in whatever asteroids happen to carry markers, the seeds of the same system that ended every civilization that came before it. They will experience the signal for the first time, without memory or warning, as their ancestors experienced it, and the cycle will continue. This is the thing that makes the marker system, viewed clearly, not evil in the way a story needs its villains to be evil. Evil implies a choice. Evil implies an alternative that was rejected in favor of harm. The marker system did not choose its role in the galaxy's history. It was refined by the same forces that refine all biological systems. The pressure to replicate efficiently in the available environment. An environment that happened to be a galaxy full of civilizations that could be guided into building copies of the thing that would consume them. The system is not evil. The system is complete. It is, as the Ophiocordyceps is within its ecological niche, the most successful organism of its kind in the environment it evolved to exploit. Its success is total. Its operation is elegant. Its indifference to the experience of the things it consumes is not cruelty. It is simply the absence of any mechanism by which such awareness could exist. The ant does not haunt the fungus. The fungus does not carry the ant's experience forward. The dead civilizations do not haunt the moons in any way the moons could be aware of. The moons carry only the biological residue of what those civilizations were, compressed into mass and processed into structure, useful as building material and nothing more. Several million years of human becoming, from the first hominid that looked at the stars to the engineers who built the ships that reached them, amounts, in the marker's accounting, to a specific volume of biomass available for convergence. That is the argument this video has been making from the beginning. The markers are not evil, they are efficient. The necromorphs are not monsters, they are instruments. Convergence is not apocalypse, it is birth. The hallucinations are not torture, they are behavioral sorting. The religion is not delusion. It is a selected for adaptation that serves the system's propagation needs. Every element that we experience as horror is a biological function. Every function serves the life cycle, and the life cycle has no reference point for the experience of the beings who live inside it. The marker system does not know it is terrifying. It does not know anything in the sense that implies awareness of what it does. It simply is what it is, doing what it does, across timescales that make human history a brief flicker in the operational record of something that was ancient before our sun formed. Now here is the thing, the detail that makes all of this genuinely worth sitting with in the dark for a few more minutes before this analysis reaches its end. The alien civilization on Tau Volantis knew all of this. They had assembled, through their own version of Serrano's research, the same understanding this video has been building toward. They knew the system was not evil. They knew it was not intelligent in any way that could be negotiated with. They knew it was a biological process operating at cosmic scale with no awareness of the beings it consumed. And they built the machine anyway. They chose to spend themselves stopping something that did not know it was being stopped. To leave behind a key for someone they would never meet, to preserve the possibility that the life cycle could be interrupted, even if they could not be the ones to interrupt it completely. They did this knowing the system did not care. There is something in that choice that the Dead Space games, for all their horror and their lore and their extraordinary world building, never quite articulate directly. Something that lives in the gap between understanding the marker as a biological system and deciding what to do with that understanding. The alien civilization understood the marker for what it was. They saw it clearly, and what they chose, in response to a universe that viewed them as raw material, was to act as if they were more than raw material anyway. Not because the universe agreed, not because the marker acknowledged the gesture, not because there was any metaphysical reward for the choice, because they were the kind of beings who made that choice. Because their consciousness, however it came to be and whatever system had cultivated it for its own purposes, was the kind of consciousness that built machines to protect things even when the cost was everything. The system built us to be harvested. Something in us, in the particular form our consciousness took, decided to resist anyway. Whether that resistance ultimately matters on the scale at which the marker system operates, the lore of Dead Space leaves genuinely open. Whether it matters on the scale of what it means to be the kind of being capable of making it, the lore leaves equally open. But the silence on that question feels deliberate. It feels like the space where each person who has spent time with this story is supposed to sit with their own answer. The moons are rising over Earth's horizon. Isaac Clarke is on a ship, looking at the red glow through a viewport. Carver is beside him. The system has done what it was built to do. And somewhere in that final image, there is still the fact that two men fought it anyway. That detail does not change the biology, but it is the detail that makes a story out of what would otherwise be only a life cycle. And that might be the most human thing about Dead Space. The part that the marker system was not built to account for. The part that outlasts the harvest, not in any physical sense, but in the sense that stories outlast the people who lived them, and stories are the one form of biomass the moons cannot process. We told each other what happened, and the telling is still happening now. Chapter 13: The Hive and the Herald. There is an entity in the Dead Space lore that tends to be treated as a boss rather than a concept. It sits beneath the surface of Aegis 7, massive and largely immobile, connected to every necromorph on or near the planet through the same signal the marker broadcasts. The game calls it the Hive Mind. It is, in the architecture of the marker system, one of the most revealing structures in the entire lore, and understanding what it actually does clarifies something about the marker's operation that the previous chapters have gestured toward without fully examining. The hive mind is not a necromorph in the way a slasher is a necromorph. The slasher and every similar necromorph form is a converted body, reanimated dead tissue reorganized around a specific functional purpose, and controlled remotely through the marker signal. The hive mind is something further along in that process. It is a consolidation node, a biological structure that formed from accumulated necromorph tissue over a long period of infection, eventually reaching a scale and complexity at which it could serve as a local relay for the marker's control signal, amplifying and distributing that signal to the necromorphs operating in its vicinity. Think of the hive mind the way you might think of a mycelial network in a large fungal organism. The individual fruiting bodies of a fungus are visible. They are the part people point to and name. But the actual organism is the mycelium, the vast underground network of filaments that connect all the individual surface expressions into one coordinated biological system. A single mushroom is not the fungus, it is an extension of the fungus. The fungus is the network. The hive mind is the necromorph equivalent of that network's central junction. It does not direct the necromorphs in the way a general directs soldiers. It broadcasts the signal that allows the necromorphs to function as a coordinated mass, the way a mycelial network coordinates nutrient distribution across a fungal colony. The individual necromorphs do not think. The hive mind does not exactly think either. The thinking, to the extent any of this involves anything recognizable as cognition, happens at the level of the Brethren moons, which are the actual command structure at the top of the entire system. The chain runs as follows. The moons broadcast the fundamental signal. The markers receive and rebroadcast that signal at the planetary level. The hive mind entity, if one forms, amplifies and distributes the signal locally. The individual necromorphs operate within the signal's framework, each type performing its assigned biological function without requiring individual direction. The system is hierarchical, the way biological systems are hierarchical, with each level of the structure amplifying and distributing the function of the level above it. This architecture has a specific implication that tends to go unexamined. The hive mind's existence on Aegis 7 means the necromorph outbreak there had been running long enough and had accumulated enough biological mass to produce a stable local control node. The marker on Aegis 7 had been in place, buried and largely inert during the colony's early history, but active enough at the signal level to begin the slow accumulation of biological transformation over time. By the time the colony's mining operations exposed the marker fully, the process was already substantially further along than anyone realized. The sudden surge of violence and suicide that consumed the Aegis 7 colony in the weeks before the Ishimura arrived was not the beginning of the marker's operation on that world. It was closer to the final stage of a process that had been quietly running for however long the marker had been present in the rock below the colony's foundations. The colonists, who began experiencing depression and sleep disturbance in the early stages of the settlement, were already inside the signal's influence zone. The anomalies that researchers noted but attributed to the stresses of colonial life, the unusual rate of conflict, the elevated psychological distress across the population, all of it was the marker's slow preparatory work long before the crisis became visible. The crisis becoming visible was the system crossing a threshold. The hive mind's existence at the moment Isaac Clarke arrives at Aegis 7 means the system has crossed several thresholds already. Enough dead tissue has been processed to produce a stable network node. Enough necromorphs have formed to sustain a planetary infestation. The marker's dead space field is still present, protecting it from premature convergence, but the biomass is accumulating toward the point at which the field will collapse and the gathering will begin. When Isaac destroys the hive mind and the marker's suppression field extends and destroys the gathered necromorphs, what he has accomplished is the disruption of a convergence event at an advanced stage. He has not destroyed the marker system. He has not even significantly damaged it. He has prevented one reproductive event from completing on one planet in a system that has completed similar events countless times on countless other worlds. The marker's response to this disruption is not defeat, it is adaptation. The signal that the Aegis 7 marker imprinted in Isaac's brain before the planet was destroyed is the adaptation. The marker, through its interaction with Isaac's uniquely compatible neurology, encoded the replication codes for a new marker directly into his neural tissue. Isaac Clarke did not escape the Aegis 7 outbreak. He carried it with him. This is the detail that Dead Space 2 builds its entire premise around, and it is the detail that most clearly illustrates the marker system's sophistication as a biological process. A system that can use the destruction of one of its components to ensure the propagation of its replication codes into a mobile carrier is a system with an extraordinary redundancy mechanism. The marker on Aegis 7 was destroyed. The information the marker needed to produce new copies was not. It was preserved in the brain of the one survivor the system had identified as compatible enough to carry it. Isaac Clarke is, from the marker system's perspective, a seed, not a chosen one in any mystical sense, a biological carrier, the same way a bird that eats a fruit carries seeds through its digestive tract and deposits them in a new location. Isaac carries the marker's replication codes in his neural tissue and moves through the human world, eventually arriving at locations where those codes can be extracted and used. The extraction happened on Titan Station, at the facility the games call the Sprawl. The Earth government researchers who had been pursuing marker research since the Black Marker's discovery knew that Isaac's brain contained the codes. They brought him to the Sprawl, kept him in a controlled environment, extracted what his neural tissue held, and used it to build the Titan Station marker, which the game designates as the Site-12 marker. The full convergence event this triggered was stopped, again by Isaac's direct intervention. The Site-12 marker was destroyed, and again the system adapted. The replication codes that had been in Isaac's brain were now in the facility's research records. The unitologists who had infiltrated EarthGov's marker research program ensured those records did not simply disappear. The Circle, the radical unitologist faction that Jacob Danik led by the time of Dead Space 3, used those records to activate markers across the known colonies simultaneously. Not one marker in one location, but dozens, triggering multiple simultaneous outbreaks across the human-colonized galaxy, with the specific intention of generating a mass convergence that the system's various failsafes could not stop one at a time. The marker system had been running a distributed strategy all along. This is visible, in retrospect, in how the red markers were distributed across human-colonized space, not clustered in one location, not all pointing toward a single convergence event, each one broadcasting independently, each one beginning its own local process, each one building toward a local crisis that, if multiple crises converge simultaneously, could produce a scale of biomass accumulation that no single countermeasure could address. The Ophiocordyceps fungus does not produce a single fruiting body. It produces many, each one operating at its own location, releasing its own spores, initiating its own new infection chains. The redundancy is not conscious planning. It is the inevitable result of a system that has been refined over millions of years to maximize reproductive success in the face of unpredictable environmental pressures. Multiple simultaneous infection sites are harder to control than single sites. Distributed systems are more resilient than centralized ones. The marker system, refined over billions of years across hundreds of civilizations, had arrived at the same solution that Ophiocordyceps arrived at over millions of years of forest ecology. Distribute the infection, multiply the sites, ensure that the elimination of any single component does not stop the whole process. Isaac Clarke's resistance, heroic and genuine and costly, was a response to a system that had already accounted for exactly that kind of resistance. Every victory he achieved was a victory against one node of a distributed network that had been designed through billions of years of refinement to survive the destruction of individual nodes. This does not reduce what Isaac did. The people on the Ishimura who might have died if the Aegis 7 convergence had completed, the people on Titan Station who might have been consumed if the Site 12 marker had finished its work, the Tau Volantis moon that was genuinely destroyed and genuinely removed from the network, these are real outcomes. The resistance mattered to the people whose lives it preserved. The resistance simply did not matter to the system in the way that the human framing of heroism implies it should. There is a concept in ecology called compensatory mortality. When a predator removes individuals from a prey population, the remaining population sometimes compensates by reproducing at a higher rate, filling the gap the predation created. The predation does not reduce the prey population in the long run. It simply intensifies the pressure on the survivors. The system absorbs the loss and continues. The marker system has been absorbing losses for billions of years. Every marker destroyed, every outbreak stopped, every convergence event prevented, was absorbed. The system continued. The network grew. The moons accumulated. The target remained. Understanding this is not despair, it is clarity. And clarity in the dead space universe, as in the real world, is the only ground on which anything genuinely useful can be built. The alien civilization on Tau Volantis understood this when they built the machine. They did not build it believing they could destroy the entire marker system. They built it believing they could stop one moon and leave the tools for others to stop more. They were realistic about the scale of the problem. They were not defeated by that realism. They were precise. Precision against a system that cannot be overwhelmed is the only strategy that has ever produced results in dead space. Isaac's most significant victories were always the result of understanding the specific mechanism he needed to disrupt, at the specific point in the process where disruption was possible, not fighting the Necromorphs as an undifferentiated horde but targeting the hive mind, not fighting the marker's signal directly but returning the marker to its pedestal, not fighting the Tau Volantis moon as a monster but reconfiguring the machine as a weapon. Precision, specificity, understanding the system well enough to identify where intervention is possible. These are not the tools of a hero in the classical sense. They are the tools of a scientist, or a naturalist, someone who looks at the organism they are dealing with and asks, with genuine curiosity and without the distortion of moral outrage, what actually makes this work and where does the mechanism have a point of failure? The alien civilization were scientists. Serrano was a scientist. Isaac Clarke, for all his emotional turmoil and grief and desperate survival instinct, is most effective when he is operating as an engineer, understanding systems and finding the intervention point. The marker is a system. Systems have intervention points. The moons are large and the network is old and the harvest has come. But the machine on Tau Volantis existed, and it worked, and it was built by beings who had every reason to give up and chose, instead, to understand precisely enough to act, whether anything similar remains possible for humanity. As the moons rise over Earth in the final image of Dead Space 3, is the question the series leaves open. The answer depends entirely on whether anyone, in the time that remains, is able to see the marker system clearly enough to find the next intervention point. Not to hate it, not to worship it, to understand it. The ant cannot understand the fungus, but the being watching the ant, the one with the microscope and the patience to observe and document and reason, can. That capacity, the capacity to stand outside a system and comprehend it clearly, is the thing the marker cultivated in humanity without intending to cultivate it, because comprehension, in the right hands, is the only force that has ever successfully disrupted the cycle. The marker grew us to be builders. Something we became in the process of becoming complex enough to build was something the marker did not grow us to be. We became observers, analysts, people who sit in the dark and try to understand what we are looking at. People like Serrano, who kept documenting even after he understood that no one was coming. People like the alien scientist who built the machine and stayed with it. People like us, sitting here now, in the quiet of a late night, trying to see something in dead space clearly enough to say something honest about it. The cycle does not account for this. The biology does not account for this. And in that small gap, in the space between what the system built us for and what we have become in the process, there is something that does not fit neatly into the marker's accounting. It might be the only thing that ever has. Chapter 14, The Full Anatomy. We began this analysis with a question, not a question about who wins or who survives or what the marker wants, a question about what the marker is. The answer, assembled across the preceding chapters, is this. The marker is a reproductive organ of a galaxy-spanning biological entity. Its specific function within the larger organism, the Brethren Moon Network, is the same as the function of any reproductive structure in any biological organism, to produce the conditions necessary for the next generation. The markers prepare host planets, manipulate the populations of those planets, generate the biomass required for a new moon to form, and ensure the replication codes are preserved and propagated forward even when individual markers are destroyed. Every horror in dead space is a biological function operating within this system. Every necromorph is a cell in a planetary reproductive apparatus. Every hallucination is a behavioral management signal. Every unitologist is a product of a selected-for adaptation that serves propagation. Every act of marker-induced violence is a biomass generation mechanism. Convergence is birth. The Brethren Moon that rises from a convergence event is a new member of the organism that produced the marker that started the cycle. The Ophiocordyceps analogy holds at every level of the system's operation. The spore that lands on the ant is the black marker landing on a host planet. The fungal cells that colonize the ant's body are the necromorphs colonizing a planetary population. The behavioral manipulation compounds that steer the ant to the right leaf at the right elevation are the marker signal's effects on intelligent minds, steering populations toward the violence and faith and technical capability that serves the system's needs. The fruiting body that rises from the dead ant's head is the Brethren Moon rising from the convergence event. The spores that rain down from the fruiting body onto the ants below are the new black markers ejected by the moon into the void between stars. Different scales, different substrates, identical logic, but the analogy, as tight as it is, has one place where it breaks. The ant colony cannot understand what is happening to it. The individuals within the colony that are infected, the colony as a whole, cannot reason about the fungus or design countermeasures or leave a machine behind for the next species to find and use. The ant colony's only defense is behavioral and instinctual. The developed response to carry infected members away from the colony before the full manipulation takes hold. This is an adaptive defense, genuinely useful, but it is not comprehension. It is pattern recognition at the colony level, a heuristic, not an analysis. The alien civilization on Tau Volantis produced something the ant colony cannot produce. They produced understanding, real, structural, mechanistic comprehension of what the marker system was doing to them and why, detailed enough to design a specific intervention at the right point in the reproductive process to disrupt it. Their understanding was hard-won and late, and cost them everything they had. but it was real understanding and it produced a real result. The Tau Volantis moon is dead. Isaac Clarke destroyed it using the tools they left behind. The existence of this counter possibility, the fact that the alien machine worked, the fact that Buckell's research eventually reached Isaac through his logs, the fact that the system can be interrupted at specific points by beings who understand it well enough to act precisely, is the part of the Dead Space lore that does not fit comfortably into a pure biological determinism. If the marker system were simply a perfect organism with no vulnerability, the story would have nowhere to go. The vulnerability is real. The interruption point is real. The machine worked. What the lore suggests, in its most honest form, is that the marker system's sophistication, its billions of years of refinement, its galaxy-spanning network, its extraordinary efficiency, did not account for one thing, the thing it cultivated in its hosts in order to make them useful as builders and replicators. The cognitive complexity that allows a species to understand symbols and design structures and transmit knowledge across generations is also the thing that allows a species to understand what the marker is and act on that understanding. The marker grew the tool that could be turned against it. This is not an irony the marker planned for, because the marker does not plan. It is not a flaw in the design, because the design does not have a designer in any conscious sense. It is a consequence, an emergent property of a system that selected for cognitive complexity in its host species without being able to select against the specific forms of cognitive complexity that lead to scientific understanding and deliberate resistance. The fungus selects for the ant's brain chemistry because the ant's brain chemistry is what it needs to manipulate. The fungus cannot simultaneously select for the kind of brain chemistry that is susceptible to its manipulation and against the kind of brain chemistry that would allow the ant to understand and prevent the manipulation. The two capacities reside in the same biological structure. You cannot have one without the risk of the other. The marker needed intelligence. Intelligence comes with the capacity for comprehension. Comprehension, applied to the right problem, produces countermeasures. The alien civilization on Tau Volantis was the clearest expression of this property the Dead Space universe offers. They were smart enough to find the marker and build copies, which is what the system needed. They were also smart enough to understand what they were doing before it was entirely too late, which is what the system did not account for. The two capacities came from the same source. The system could not have one without accepting the risk of the other. Humanity was cultivated for the same capacities. The history of the Dead Space series is partly the history of those capacities being expressed in the wrong direction, in the direction the marker needed, through Unitology and EarthGov's marker programs, and the Circle's mass activation campaign. But the other direction is also present. Serrano's research, the alien machine, Isaac Clarke's interventions, however insufficient at the cosmic scale, genuine at the human one. The capacity for understanding that the marker's cultivation produced was a double-edged product. The system bet the useful edge would dominate. It has dominated across most of the civilizations the moons represent. The analysis edge, the comprehension edge, the edge that turns understanding into deliberate action against the system, has so far only produced one confirmed success and one partial, costly near success. The Tau Volantis civilization's machine is the full success. Isaac's resistance is the near success. Genuine in outcome, but insufficient in scope, two documented cases against the implied hundreds of failed civilizations represented by the Brethren Moon Network. The system's bet was correct in almost every case. Almost is the word that keeps the lights on. Almost is the word the alien civilization carved into the design of their machine when they left the codex behind for someone who had not been born yet. Almost is the word that Serrano's logs breathe between every line of his cold, precise documentation. Almost is the word Isaac Clarke embodies across 3 games of survival and grief and desperate, insufficient heroism. Almost means the system has not won yet. Almost means the intervention point exists. Almost means comprehension has produced results before, and might, in the right hands at the right moment, produce them again. This is not hope in the soft, comfortable sense. It is a precise and uncomfortable almost. the kind that requires understanding the system clearly enough to identify where the mechanism fails, building something that works at the right point of failure, and paying whatever the cost turns out to be. The alien civilization paid with their world. The cost of the next intervention point is not yet priced. The marker does not know it has left a vulnerability. The moons do not know they have cultivated the thing that can resist them. The system continues operating, as it has operated for billions of years, as it will continue operating for billions more, indifferent to the outcomes that live in the small space between what it built and what it built has become. In that small space, the stories get told, the machines get built, the logs get left behind. In that small space, there is something that is not biomass, not biological function, not a reproductive outcome or a behavioral management result, or a cultivated cognitive trait. There is the specific weight of a person who understood what they were looking at and chose to document it anyway. Serrano, alone on a frozen planet, writing logs he had no certainty anyone would ever find. The alien scientists, maintaining the machine they had built at the cost of everything they were, knowing the moons were still out there, knowing the cycle would continue beyond what they could stop. The marker accounts for everything except the irreducible fact of that choice. And the fact that you are here, in the dark, at whatever hour this is, following the logic of a biological system through a video game universe because something about seeing it clearly felt worth doing, is the same kind of fact. The ant is locked onto the leaf. The fruiting body is growing. The spores are coming. And somewhere in the forest, something is watching and writing it down. That is not nothing. That is not what the system intended. In biology, in ecology, in the long history of parasitic systems and host responses, the most significant evolutionary events are the ones the parasite did not anticipate. The moment the host develops a response the parasite's mechanism did not account for is the moment the co-evolutionary relationship shifts. It does not always shift enough to save the current host, but it shifts, and the shift becomes part of the biological record that future generations inherit. The alien civilization's machine is exactly this, a host response that the marker system did not anticipate, a shift encoded in the ruins of Tau Volantis, waiting in the ice for the next species that arrived with the cognitive complexity to use it. The Dead Space universe does not tell us whether humanity managed to produce the equivalent. The series ended before that story could be told. The moons rose over Earth. The screens went dark. The question was left open. Open questions are where the interesting things live, because the marker, for all its cosmic scope, and its billions of years of refinement, and its total indifference to anything that moves through its shadow, did not account for one specific thing. It did not account for the possibility that something it grew to serve its own purposes would spend a late night trying to see it clearly. It did not account for the fact that understanding a system is always the first step toward disrupting it. And it did not account for this, that the very cognitive complexity it required, the intelligence it cultivated across 65 million years of slow biological pressure, would turn out to produce beings who tell each other stories about what they are looking at. The moons broadcast their signal. The signal reaches out across the cold between stars. The markers rebroadcasted on planetary surfaces, adjusting it to the specific neurological frequencies of whatever species happens to be listening. The species that was listening, this time, started asking questions. Questions are not biomass. Questions are not a convergence event. Questions are not a necromorph, or a moon, or a reproductive success for a system that has never needed to account for them before. Questions are the only thing in the Dead Space universe that does not fit inside the marker's accounting. And everything that matters, in the gap between what the system built and what it accidentally produced, begins with them. The signal is still out there. The system is still running. The moons that rose over Earth at the end of Dead Space 3 are somewhere in orbit, doing what moons do, but in the ruins below, in the frozen corridors, and the abandoned research stations, and the ships drifting empty in the dark, someone left logs. Someone always leaves logs. 65 million years of patience, and the marker never needed to announce itself. It just waited for us to become exactly what it needed. The part it could not calculate for was what we might become in the space beyond that, what we might understand, what we might document, what we might leave behind for the next person who arrives at the right moment with the right question. That is the only thing in this entire story that the biology does not account for. Hold on to that.